I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Stephen.
And thank you for the formal. Stephen. I'm Stephen now. I'm glad we're at a Stephen stage. I just want to remind everybody, David, as I'm sure you're excited about, Wednesday, March 30th, next week at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, our guest will be Jesse Singer, author of There Are No Accidents, The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price? And we're going to be doing that as a live Zoom.
It's an opportunity for everybody to watch how this show gets made.
Yes, which is it's a fascinating process to watch. And you get to see our mugs on the screen, at least mine and David's. So go to ralphnaderradiohour.com to sign up and be in our live Zoom audience. And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, do sign up. Make it a really large audience. Get your friends and neighbors to take a peek.
Up first, we're going to talk to Professor Theodore Postol, who's an expert on nuclear weapon systems and Professor Emeritus of Science, Technology, and National Security Policy at MIT. He's worked for the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, the Pentagon, Argonne National Laboratory, and he's here today to talk about how nuclear weapons might factor into the current war in Ukraine. And we're going to close out the show with our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, to give us his take on the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, nuclear weapons used to be unthinkable. So why are we thinking about them? David?
Theodore Postol is Professor Emeritus of Science, Technology, and National Security Policy at MIT. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Theodore Postol.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome indeed, Ted. If there's anybody in the world who knows more about intercontinental ballistic missiles, let me just frame it for our audience. I want to quote you. You say, quote, "The Russian early warning system is nothing like the U.S. early warning system. The U.S. government knows when a ballistic missile has been launched anywhere in the world. The Russians can't do that. They completely rely on ground-based early warning radars against nuclear surprise attack. As a result of this, the Russians are susceptible to thinking they are under attack when they are not. The Russian false alert of 1995 illustrates the serious dangers to the U.S. from this limitation in Russia's early warning systems. The 1995 false alarm happened to take place during a politically calm time between Moscow and Washington. If such a mistake were to happen now, there would be a very serious risk of nuclear war, which would kill billions of people," end quote. Give us your view now, what the situation is in the Ukraine-Russian war.
The situation, unfortunately, well, I've been trying to find out as much detail as I can. And of course, there is information, but of course, it's very spotty. But I think right now, nothing is going as most informed experts, including myself, would have expected. For example, I thought, along with many other people who have some knowledge of military operations, that Russia could very quickly take Kiev. That is to say, at the beginning of the operation, it looked to me like the Russians were planning on quickly penetrating in a blitzkrieg-like way into Ukraine and surrounding Kiev and then basically taking it. It is very clear that the intelligence, the Russian intelligence, and certainly what I thought was the case at the time, so I admit a complete misjudgment, the plans were built on the misconception that the Ukrainians would not fight and that they could not fight. It turns out that the Ukrainians not only are fighting, but I think that the level of skill and determination that really goes from the foot soldier to the top military command in Ukraine. So I think this is a military that is showing tremendous ingenuity and competence, in addition, of course, to extremely competently using the weapons they have available. And I would have told you even a week ago or, a few days ago that the outcome was probably going to be Russia taking the Ukraine. And this was not my hope, but it was what I was guessing. I'm not so sure now. It may be that the Ukrainians can stand off the Russians. They've inflicted tremendous casualties on the Russian force.
And how's this going to affect Putin's nuclear strategy,
Oh, well,
if at all?
Well, I think he's in a corner. And when someone's in a corner, it's a dangerous situation. It's much more dangerous with regard to the possibility of nuclear escalation now than it was a week ago, because, he may be, this is all speculation, but it's not totally uninformed. He may be facing an internal crisis with regard to his own leadership at this point. It's very likely people we don't know, I want to underscore we don't know, but it's very likely that people inside the leadership structure are pointing fingers at each other. The army has failed to produce what it claimed it would produce. They obviously thought it was going to be a cakewalk, and it's been hardly a cakewalk. It's been a military disaster. And Putin is presumably furious at his underlings, including his own intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies should have known that the spirit in Ukraine was towards fighting. In other words, they completely misinformed or misjudged the spirit of the Ukrainian people and the military. And now Putin is in a desperate situation. And people are fleeing Russia. I already am in contact with friends who we have already told them they can come and stay with us, Russians. And, obviously Ukrainians are fleeing for their lives. And the situation is very fluid and very dangerous from the point of view of Putin, who is not inclined to back down, at least from what we can see now. And
so how would use of his tactical weapons be an advantage to him at all? Short-range tactical nuclear weapons.
The reality is they're not, but the perception, if he perceives that they are, anything is possible. Nobody rational is ever going to use nuclear weapons. The problem is miscalculation, misperception, accidents. But we're in a situation now where a misperception or a misjudgment seems more likely. And if he were totally rational, he would say, no, I'm not getting close to this. It's like the argument for low-yield nuclear weapons is like an argument that I'm in a room filled with gasoline vapor, and instead of lighting a match, I'm just going to make a little spark, and maybe I'll keep the whole place from going up. And it's really, conceptually, it really is that meaningless difference, because the Russian doctrine, in part built by Putin, in fact, has focused on the potential use for nuclear weapons to stave off a disaster that would lead to the loss of Russia as a nation, the non-survival of Russia as a nation. And so they have this doctrine, which incidentally was brought about in deep consultation with Putin himself. The concept, it's crazy. Let me just tell you what I think of it before I describe it to you, so there's no misunderstanding here. The concept is they call it escalate to de-escalate. The idea is simple but wrong. The idea is that you use a low-yield nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon. This tactical nuclear weapon, incidentally, is maybe half or a third the yield of the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima, which means it would destroy a very large area, not quite equal to Hiroshima, but 50 or 60% of the area that was destroyed in Hiroshima. So that's hardly nothing. And the idea is that you use this weapon as a vehicle for showing how desperate you are, and you cause everybody to just stop. Now, I don't know how you use it in this situation, because you are not under attack. You are not trying to stop an advance into your country. You are the one in control of the forces in Ukraine. You can stop the forces in Ukraine. So what are you going to use this nuclear weapon for? The Ukrainians are not going to surrender, I don't think, if you use a single nuclear weapon. They're going to just hold their positions, I think. And then the question will be, what do all the other nuclear powers, and what does the United States do, or NATO, if you want to? And what will happen, absolutely, because it's a military response, is NATO will put all of its nuclear weapons on alert in a preparation for a counterstrike. Doesn't mean they will counterstrike, But then the Russians will be having to prepare for the possibility of a counterstrike from NATO and the United States. No one will have any idea what's happening. Think of the 9/11 situation where the World Trade Centers were attacked. None of our communication systems were corrupted. Basically, everything in the United States was functioning, but we had no idea what was going on. We were so worried that there were more planes coming that we grounded every airplane in the country. The problem with using even a single nuclear weapon is, even though you can write out on paper what kinds of vast capable communication systems we have and sensors all over the world and in space, even though you have all those things, the reality is you really don't know what's happening. There's too much.
Well, let me interject, Ted. When Russia and NATO, meaning the U.S., escalates into a higher level of readiness, you're saying that that increases the risk of accidental releases.
Absolutely.
Explain that to our audience.
Well, just for a second, let me ask the audience to imagine you are a high-level military officer in either Russian or American military forces, and you're a perfectly rational, capable person. You may not be a person whose views you agree with, but, sensible, professional. And your job is to provide for military capability if it is needed. You're not looking for trouble, but you are in the command of your leadership. So your job is to be prepared militarily for anything that can happen. So what happens is you see the adversary doing something that looks like it could be a prelude to a significant escalation. What do? You immediately take action to protect your forces. You disperse your forces. You prepare them to fight if they need be, or to move quickly. But what does the adversary see? The adversary sees you dispersing your forces and preparing them to fight. Well, that means that that's a possibility. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. So you start dispersing your forces and preparing to fight. And of course, the forces are like, imagine you're playing a chess game where you can't see the chessboard, right? You can only see one piece at a time. The rest of the board is completely opaque to you. And the pieces on both sides are moving without you directing them to move. So you got this situation where all kinds of actions are being taken by lower level commanding officers who are just simply trying to be prudent and protect their forces and prepare and be prepared to fight. And they're taking actions and they run into somebody and you have a firefight, or there's a submarine operating too near one of the other's warships and they get detected and they try to drive them to the surface or they attack them. There are all kinds of possibilities, aircraft encountering each other.
On that basis, there still is very close communication potential between Putin and Biden. They have the so-called red phone and they've upgraded it. Is that something to reassure people? That should help as long as they're talking. But it doesn't necessarily mean Putin knows what's happening or Biden. I mean, because all they know is what is the information they get from the field. And, a plane is all of a sudden down and there are other planes in the area. You can't even tell when there's air combat which of the planes are yours and which are not. It's very hard to do. You have these elaborate systems called IFF systems, but they don't always work. And then once these planes get into a situation where they're close together, even the air defense systems can't tell who is who. So in military operations, you typically have what are called air defense zones. In other words, you don't fly, even if you're an American and you have Patriot units below you, you don't fly into that air defense zone because you will be shot at. They don't know who you are. So there's just a lot of unknowns in a military confrontation that have to be managed. And, by and large, the militaries are pretty sophisticated at doing this. So I'm not suggesting that, they're incompetent. They're actually amazingly competent at these things. We don't hear on the mass media the kind of things that you're saying. You're not getting on the national TV or radio or into the newspapers. But if the public isn't informed about this, they can be induced to become very aggressive. Biden's language, I think, seems to be overly aggressive. unnecessarily aggressive to Russia because you don't want to humiliate a dictator who's losing a war against Ukraine and has no back door, no escape hatch.
Yeah, you need to give him a way out.
Berserk.
He needs to be given a way out. And I don't see any evidence for that at this time. I have thought that Biden has been handling the situation reasonably well by making it clear that he understands, that Biden understands there are red lines that the West cannot cross, and transmitting that clearly and unambiguously to Putin. My concern is that the belligerence in the tone and language is raising the ante in a way that is not constructive.
By red lines, you're saying they have to reassure Russia and Putin they're not going to attack Russia or invade Russia. Is that what you mean by red lines?
Yeah, or for example, Biden has made it clear that he's not sending American or allowing NATO troops to go into Ukraine to help. That's important. That's very important. He's made it clear that he is not going to respond to Zelensky's pleas for help setting up a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He's not going to do that because that would be a step too far, and he's made it clear. So where it's really tricky is resupplying Ukraine with more weapons, because at some point, what could happen, I hope it doesn't, but what could happen is this resupply chain that's bringing anti-aircraft weapons and anti-tank weapons into Ukraine could start being attacked by the Russians. Once they're in Ukraine, they're a valid target. They're military supplies. One of the things you always try to get attack or destroy, if you can, are the military logistics of your adversary. Without strong logistics, modern armies cannot function. We've seen that on the Russian side. They miscalculated their logistics needs initially, and now the logistics is even worse because the Ukrainians have very skillfully been attacking their logistics. You don't want to be driving a truck that looks like it's carrying fuel, in Ukraine, because it's much easier to destroy than a tank. And it's a very high priority target because tanks don't operate and armored vehicles don't operate unless they have fuel.
We're talking with Professor Ted Postol. What more materials can they read that you've written over the years? You've written in the New York Times, you've testified before Congress. How can people read more about what you're saying?
Well, I think the danger right now, in my view, the greatest danger is the possibility of nuclear use leading to uncontrolled escalation. The other things going on are terrible. I don't want anyone to misunderstand. The loss of life is terrible. But if this thing if an accidental use or misunderstanding occurs in some way or another that leads to the use of nuclear weapons, it will, with very high probability, escalate out of control in a very short time. It's possible it will be constrained, but it's very unlikely. And so what we all should be worried about is keeping a lid on things.
And when you say short time, you're talking hours.
It could be hours,
right?
could be hours. It could be a day or two leading to something that escalates in hours. There's just so many, there's an infinite number of scenarios you could invent, all of which are plausible. An infinite number of plausible and, possibilities. That's what makes it so frightening.
Steve?
Yes, Professor Postol, if one of these tactical nuclear weapons were to be used, what are the long-term radiation effects in the area that it's used?
Well, let me just step back. The problem is not simply the immediate terrifying and terrible effects. The problem is the escalation that would certainly bring about. But since you're asking, I don't want to sound like a lunatic here, but I'll say the consequences would be very severe, but only relatively local. And when I say only relatively local, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that it's the first step in something vast that would be following. But on a local level, you would destroy an area maybe 6 or 7 tenths of a mile in radius. So that's not trivial. That's, a few square miles of area if it's a city. There would be intense fires in these areas because the explosion of the nuclear weapon, people focus on the blast from the nuclear weapon, but it's really the way to think of a nuclear weapon is someone has been able to stick their metaphorical hand into the center of the sun and bring the center of the sun down to the earth and let it release its energy until it dissipates. And so, the initial temperature in the nuclear weapon can be tens of millions of degrees Kelvin or higher. And this rapidly cools, producing a fireball. But the fireball cools to a temperature of maybe 2,000 degrees hotter than the equivalent area of the sun. And that radiates an enormous amount of light and heat on the terrain below and ignites all kinds of things. So what you do is you get a very large area fire, and it's an area fire. It's important to understand. It's not like, when you read histories of London burning down or San Francisco, there's a line of fire that burns through the city. In this case, everything is on fire simultaneously. And the result is you get a mass fire of enormous intensity. And on the ground where that mass fire is burning, it generates buoyantly rising air over areas of many square miles. And that buoyantly rising air causes afterwinds behind it, like you see when a fireplace is burning. And inside the fire zone, the wind speeds can easily be of hurricane force, and the temperature of the air can easily be above the boiling point of water. So nobody survives that, nobody. And then, of course, you have a radioactive plume, which may or may not occur depending on whether the weapon was exploded close to the ground or not. If it's exploded close to the ground, you can have a radioactive plume, small particles of material that have radioactive material attached to them that can spread lethal radiation downwind. So it's a very narrow plume, but you don't know where it's going, of course, if when this kind of thing occurs. And it's a narrow plume, but it could spread for many miles downwind. And people in its path will receive lethal doses of radiation. It depends, of course, on the weather. If the nuclear weapon is detonated at somewhat higher altitude where it doesn't generate all this ground particles, the fire creates tiny particles of ash and uncombusted material. That material rises buoyantly from the fire zone, and it's laden with water vapor. It's got water vapor into cooler air, and it'll start raining out downwind, and it will also be highly radioactive. This was known as the black rain in Hiroshima. This rain that was just black. It was just generated from ash from the burning fires and a dense water vapor cloud that was condensing and raining onto the area below. So although this is a small nuclear weapon, so it's almost of trivial significance relative to what else will follow, it's not insignificant. And people will not know exactly what happened. All they will know is that there was this big cloud on the horizon. People inside it will be dead or dying, and that there's radiation. And what happened with Chernobyl? It was a world panic over it because people didn't know what was happening. People have a great fear of radioactivity, which I find understandable. And that's just this one consequence.
David?
Yes. Are we still operating under mutual assured destruction? It seems to me that most Americans believe that it's mutual assured destruction, and that's why nobody's going to press the button. Have we pulled out of ABM treaties? Have we modified ABM treaties?
The way I would describe mutual assured destruction is that it's an existential condition, not so much a policy. So, for example, if you know that if I attack you, the result will be both of us dying, then you know that I will be deterred if I'm reasonable and logical from attacking you, if I'm not suicidal. And the same could be true of you. So that's an existential condition. We both restrain ourselves, even though we might hate each other or see each other as a terrible threat, from attacking the other because we know that both of us will die. So it's an existential condition. Now, when you build these missile defenses, you implicitly, you are suggesting that you think you can escape some aspect of this existential condition. It's not so much a change in policy as it is an indication that you don't necessarily fully accept that this existential condition cannot be dealt with. And that's one of the reasons why these missile defenses in the case of nuclear weaponry is a very dangerous thing to do, because it looks like you think you can escape the consequences, and this makes a potential adversary nervous, because I think it's very clear if we look very carefully, and I have done this, so I'm talking now from having studied this. If we look very carefully over the last few years about what Putin has done and what he has said about nuclear weapons, it is very clear that he is concerned that Western leadership might incorrectly believe that they can depend on missile defenses at some future time. He is very clear that he doesn't think they'll work. These missile defenses will work. But he's also been very clear that he is preparing for the possibility that if anyone tries to use them, he will assure them under any condition you can imagine that they will suffer the existential consequences of using nuclear weapons. It's very clear that he's afraid of what we think we understand, of what leaders think we understand. Now, I think it's extremely important that we understand that this man, Putin, is extremely intelligent and is a deep thinker about these strategic issues. He has made a terrible mistake. He is a terrible person. There's no question. The man has none of the moral constraints that an ethical person at any level would have. But it's a big mistake to assume that he's stupid. I think that's the problem here. People don't want to do that. And he's afraid of what the Americans might do. It's not a good situation.
Air defense, anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs, Iron Dome, the Patriot missile. There seems to be this idea that America can shoot incoming missiles out of the sky with our Patriot missiles. Poland has our Patriot missiles. They're moving them around Europe, supposedly to protect Europe from incoming Russian missiles. Do these things work?
I would say these systems, to a very good first approximation, have no capability. None. There is a small chance, extremely small chance, which we have not yet seen, that one of these Patriot missiles could run into the front end of an incoming missile. That's the only chance that they have of actually destroying that missile. And that is near zero chance, because the probability of such an encounter is very low. And incidentally, the missiles that the Patriots would be trying to intercept are of long enough range that they will be coming in fast enough that the Patriot interceptors will not even they'll not even see the incoming missile before it passes by. So, it's like trying to use a baseball bat to hit a hypersonic baseball that has been launched from somewhere where you don't know it's coming from. You wouldn't even know where it came from.
This is astounding, because the official White House Pentagon line since Reagan started the Star Wars program was that they're getting more and more accurate, and they're shooting down some of these missiles at experimental sites in Alaska and elsewhere, and it's already cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And what you're saying is it's a fraud.
It is a fraud. Fraud is a kind word, but it's a fraud. And I have been very concerned about the ethical dimensions of this. I've repeatedly said that this is unethical to tell people that these systems will protect them. It's like knowing that a bridge is going to fall down if you use it and telling people to go ahead and use it. Or maybe another analogy is like or if you want to put it in a more military context, you have rifles that will jam and not work, and you send your people into combat with them. This is the ultimately immoral thing to do. And we've been doing it now for decades. I've been trying. I don't know how many times I have caught these guys making a lie. Well, I've been on the front page of the New York Times several times with having exposed frauds. The Times no longer talks to me because I'm no longer politically correct. But I was on the front page of the New York Times, published many op-eds in the New York Times over time, and they were right. No one has shown that the stuff I've done is wrong. In fact, It's been, as people delved into it further, they found out that what I was saying was absolutely correct. So,
and to be clear, you were talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles. You're not talking about these primitive garage-built rockets that Iron Dome is supposedly shooting down at a high percentage of effectiveness. They're just totally incomparable, correct?
They're totally incomparable, but I have to say that, sorry to say this, but Iron Dome is also not working, and I've been looking at that. It's a much easier target in some ways, an artillery rocket, but it's still too hard a target, and Iron Dome has not been very successful.
Can a jet fighter shoot a missile out of the sky?
You see, there's a process that has to go on to shoot down a missile. It's not complex, but you first have to see the missile coming. Now, remember that the missile can be traveling very fast. In fact, they will be. So seeing it is not so easy. If you imagine looking up in the sky for an object falling, you would see maybe blue sky or clouds. And the object has a very small cross-section. Think of a missile coming at you, may have a diameter of 1 or 2 feet. And so you're going to be blinded by the light, just the blue sky alone, and it's like trying to see, a small bird flying at very high altitude. You just can't see it. And it's a small bird that's traveling at hypersonic speed at you. So you first have to acquire it. And then you have to decide where you can hope to intercept it, because you have an interceptor that is generally traveling quite a lot slower than the incoming missile. So you're going to have to get ahead of it somewhere and then, try to get ahead of it and run into it. And your interceptor may not have nearly the speed to get to an intercept point, even if you know it's coming in. Now, an airplane does not have the kind of radar and infrared systems that would allow it to detect an incoming, let's say, a missile like the Iskander, this missile that the Russians are now using extensively in Ukraine. You wouldn't see it. You couldn't see it with the systems on the plane. So if you did see it, you don't have an interceptor on the plane that's fast enough to get to an intercept point. And on top of that, the interceptor does not have a detection range against the object that is long enough range that it can see it early enough to make the final maneuvers to hit it. So it's basically not possible given current systems. And quite frankly,
by the way, listeners think that Professor Ted Postol is a lone voice here. Years ago, the American Physical Society, which is made up of establishment physicists, some of them consultants to the Pentagon, put out a report, if I recall, saying that Star Wars was unworkable. It required levels of complexity to the software that were impossible to attain. Well, we're out of time. We've been talking with Professor Ted Postol, emeritus of MIT, an expert on the technology of nuclear warfare, among other things, and a public citizen speaking out against it. Is there anything else you want to say to our audience, Ted, before we conclude?
Well, I guess all I'd like to say is that the world is in grave danger, and we all need to hope and do what we can to influence our political decision makers to make wise decisions so that we don't get some kind of accident or series of accidents that rapidly escalate into nuclear weapons use, because it will kill us all. I believe that Biden does understand that. I mean, he's shown a good deal of common sense on this. I have to say, this Jens Stoltenberg, this NATO Secretary General, he should just be quiet. They should just tell him to be quiet. I don't know who he is anyway. He's not an elected official. He represents a bunch of countries, and he's just dangerous. We have a man who has made a terrible, probably irrecoverable mistake, Vladimir Putin. He's going to be desperate, and we've got to try to find a way to help him back out of this corner without using nuclear weapons. And this is the task for our leadership in combination with others.
On that sober note, thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Professor Ted Postol. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we're going to talk to our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, about the hearings for Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 25, 2022. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Scott Charmoli's patient's teeth were just fine, but Fein wasn't making him enough money. Federal prosecutors alleged that the dentist in Jackson, Wisconsin, drilled into and broke his patient's teeth in order to charge them for fixing the damage he'd caused. By so doing, the dentist went from pulling in $1.4 million and affixing 434 crowns in 2014 to raking in $2.5 million and performing more than 1,000 crown procedures a year later. That's according to a report in the Washington Post. Following a 4-day trial, Charmoli, 61, was convicted of 5 counts of healthcare fraud and 2 counts of making false statements about his patient's treatment. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan with David Feldman and Ralph. And I want to welcome back friend of the show and resident constitutional scholar Bruce Fein. He's going to give us his take on the hearings for Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. Welcome back, Bruce.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, Bruce, a couple quick, simple questions before you go into what it has not been asked and discussed in these hearings. First of all, why the marathon 13 hours, grueling pace for a Congress that only works 3 days a week when it's in session? What's the purpose of this marathon that is really not good for public view? Who's going to stick with 13 hours in one day? What's the purpose of this kind of grueling schedule instead of spreading it out? Why don't they have 6-hour sessions instead of 13-hour sessions? What are they trying to do? Beat down the stamina of the nominee, or they want to get out by Friday so they can have their weekend?
Well, it's a combination of that. We know that the hours are calculated, to enable them to get back to fundraise. They want to have time as well to get free advertising in their question and answer period. And so they are orchestrated to raise the political issues that are useful for their constituents. But you're right that there isn't any need to 13-hour marathon sessions, but they only work 3 days a week anymore, and fundraising is more important to them than hearings.
Well, the other point you made and I made is there's no longer any public input by citizen witnesses. I testified with Dr. Sidney Wolf on the Steve Breyer nomination. You've testified twice on 2 nominations for the Supreme Court before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And now it's not possible. The Judiciary Committee is closing out the American people. They just have the witness, they have the statements by the senators, then they have 2 sessions choreographed, one by the Republican, one by the Democrat, and then it's over. What do you say about this lack of public input, and why is it bad?
Well, the reason why it's bad is because, number one, there's not enough known about how the Supreme Court operates anyway. It doesn't permit cameras in the courtroom. Now, at least you can go on your internet and listen to the audio tapes on some of the oral arguments, but it's very important for the public to have a maximum understanding of how court proceedings occur, the demeanor of the justices, and what issues are relevant, not only to give confidence in the system, but how they should consider their votes when candidates run for office based upon what kind of individuals they propose to appoint to the United States Supreme Court. But the other reason why it's so dysfunctional not to have public testimony is that the members themselves typically focus on issues that are narrow parochial concern to their particular political constituency, that is irrelevant to the larger issues that are far important to everyone. And that's exemplified by the questioning that we've witnessed so far. These major areas of congressional abdication, state secrets, wars without any congressional input, infinite delegations and presidential actions that are the equivalent of a legislation, executive agreements as treaties, they go totally unexamined in the hearings. You need public witnesses that have a broader perspective to bring these issues to the fore and make it a far more educational process than what it is now. It's simply campaign opportunities for Republicans and Democrats.
Well, this cloistered strategy now by both parties, they've done it for both the Democrat and Republican nominees to the Supreme Court, is very troubling because you asked to testify formally on the Judge Jackson nomination. You wanted to make a couple important points about separation of powers and about what happens to a Supreme Court when it has nobody from legislative experience. Most of them are corporate lawyers. And you were turned down. So you were invited to submit testimony for the record, which you did. But why do you think that there isn't anybody on that large Judiciary Committee who will raise issues of corporate personhood, corporate crime, the violations that corporate hegemony inflicts on this country, not to mention the abdication of constitutional authority by the Congress itself? It doesn't declare war anymore. It lets the presidents decide when and where to use armed force and to make wars around the world. What do you think should be done about this?
Well, first, the cause before you get to the remedy. I think the causes are largely twofold. Number one, with a Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, it magnified the importance of money in politics. And what we have is on both sides, huge amounts of money flowing in to campaign coffers. I think if you took Mitch McConnell's slush fund and Nancy Pelosi's combined, it's like $800 million. And so they are marching to the tune of corporate interests. And unfortunately, it's on both sides. And that's why you find, despite the fact that I think public funding is adequate for presidential campaigns, that the nominees of both parties say this is stupid. We're not going to accept public money and forego our private treasure chest, which is double or triple what the public money would yield. But the second element, Ralph, is that there is this ethos in Congress that escapes from accountability and simply wants to act as a talking shop and shout their campaign slogans and then hand it off to the executive to make all the decisions. So they can't be primary. They don't decide anything. And if things go bad, they just blame it on the executive. And that's an unfortunate circumstance that has progressively gotten worse over the years. And now both parties are eager to just give away the whole House to the executive. Recently, there was a big article in the Washington Post about many members on more the liberal side, progressive side, telling Biden, hey, don't come to us with legislation, just rule by executive order. And wait a minute, you have to sit down and make sure you have a majority. You have to compromise, you do. The legislative process can be difficult, but that's how the Constitution says we ought to enact policy. And unfortunately, not only is it wrongheaded constitutionally, you come in with an executive order. The next president comes in and he undoes what's done before. And you have this kind of accordion-like approach to what the law is. And we've seen that happen in what happened between Trump and Obama, and now from Trump to Biden. And we have regulations. They're there for one day and then they're gone the next. That's not the kind of law that we want to have. It should be far more stable, and it has to be debated in the public forum, which is Congress. The executive branch largely operates in secrecy.
Well, my reaction to the hearings on Judge Jackson is first massive hypocrisy by people like Ted Cruz and Marsha Blackburn, trying to pin a soft on crime label on Judge Jackson, by which they mean street crime. And these are senators, among others, who are taking money to be soft on corporate crime. They have defunded the corporate crime police in the federal government. There are not enough federal cops going after the corporate crime wave and nabbing the corporate criminals. That is just the type of hypocrisy that a senator like Senator Blumenthal or Senator Whitehouse should have pointed out to the American people. And the second aspect of it is someone would think that the major problem in the country today is child pornography, not corporate pornography, violent programs inflicted on young people, interactive mayhem so they can participate in the slaughter, the kind of violence of junk food that leads to obesity and all the diseases that come from seducing these young people by corporate advertising, the corporate pesticides and contaminants in the environment that afflict children even more than adults, lead in drinking water, a successor of the lead rampage years ago before environmental groups banned it. This is something that's got to be challenged, and I don't see anything in the commentary by NPR, PBS, New York Times. It's just they're skimming over this whole thing. What do you recommend for the next round here? Let's say there's going to be another Supreme Court nominee, and there's plenty of time to lay the civic groundwork. What would you do?
Well, the first thing to do is insist that there are public witnesses who are not orchestrated to raise the issues that we know that the members themselves are not going to raise either because, they're compromised by their political campaign donations, or that they just don't do the homework necessary in order to understand how vast this wasteland is when it comes to corporate power and their escape from criminal accountability. You remember the famous or infamous statement made by former Attorney General Eric Holder. Well, some banks are too big to fail and to prosecute. There are too many ramifications. This is a Democratic Attorney General, and the Republican side is similar. And that has to be overcome by opening up the universe of people who are able to use the platform to educate the American people to the whole canvas rather than just a narrow one. I don't know how you change the members themselves. Campaign finance reform is problematic because of Supreme Court decisions and the kind of people who run for office, but certainly a demand that they have more public witnesses who are not confined in what they can raise as an important issue to be addressed is critical here. One of the other elements, Ralph, that was hypocritical that adds to what you're saying is that the Congress enacts the laws that provide for sentences. And Congress created the Sentencing Commission, and the sentences that were being used to assail Judge Jackson were sentences that were recommended by a sentencing commission that had Trump judges on it that were rated by consensus. And indeed, you had even Trump judges saying, no, that she wasn't out of bounds. We all agreed on these issues. Judge Pryor was one who fell into that category. And so if they were actually fair-minded, they would have to say, well, we have our own judges that we eagerly confirmed on the Republican side who joined you in recommending these as sentences. But, you don't get any kind of fair-minded exposure of all the dimensions of a question. And so it ends up being quite distorted.
Well, it's dictatorial. That's what it is. It's dictatorial. Basically, two parties on the Judiciary Committee, they don't challenge each other and rebut each other. They don't allow citizen witnesses to sit in the chair and rebut the kind of stuff that's coming from these senators. And so basically you have an enclosure system where Congress is a very profitable corporate-funded cocoon. And it's getting worse and worse, listeners. There used to be a time when Supreme Court nominees were challenged by all kinds of leading citizen groups, like the Judge Bork confirmation. But now it's all closed down. And I think that some listeners may be upset enough to ask their senators, what gives here? We want an explanation, and the next Supreme Court nominee should be in a proceeding open to citizen input.
To underscore the importance, what you've remarked, Ralph, is that because we're dealing in some sense of a specialized area, of certainly law, constitutional law, it is the outside experts who need to come in and point out the deficiencies of the members in their questioning and saying, we need to ask, well, what about X, Y, Z? You can't expect a layperson to understand what's being neglected. They don't see the whole canvas like a trained, lawyer is, like you or me. And that's what makes it so regrettable that you're denying the audience a full spectrum of information that would enable them to see the deficiencies and call in or write in or email, text message their member and say, what's going on here? Your own questioning was very narrow, and why did you neglect to look at X, Y, Z? Education, education, education. It is so critical here. And you're right, Congress is just throwing spanners in the works that occlude the education rather than open it up.
By the way, here's the inside scoop.
Yeah.
When I talked to the chief of staff, and I said, look, Bruce Fein wants to testify. He's testified twice. I'd like to testify, but I'm not putting myself on the table for that. Why aren't you allowing any citizen testimony? He says, well, tell you the truth. The margin of error is so thin on this nomination that the rule is do no harm, which means everything has to be predictable, limited, and controlled. Do no harm. Because one slip up and you can lose the nomination. That's the attitude up there.
Yeah.
By the Democrats. Thank you very much, Bruce Fein. Thank you for coming on again, and I hope that your remarks have helped stimulate a little feedback. It would be good just to get someone like Senator Blumenthal or Senator Whitehouse to respond, and we could read that response if people back in Connecticut and Rhode Island take the effort to ask why are citizen leaders or citizen scholars who are independently minded, not allowed to testify at confirmation hearings on the nomination of Supreme Court justices, who are given a lifetime sinecure. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you.
Let's fit in a listener question here, David.
This comes to us from Daria Laverne, and the subject is the Chinese Boeing 737-800 crash. She writes, I'm seeing reports that this plane is not the same as the 737 MAX. Would you please post something about this to help us understand if there is any difference at all? I've heard reports that it is the same exact plane, but I've not seen anything to refute that.
The crash in China was a NG 737 Boeing plane. It was not the 737 MAX. The NG is being flown all over the world. It's the workhorse. There are many thousands of these planes flying. The 737 MAX replaced the NG because Boeing wanted larger engines to compete with Airbus, and that led to the aerodynamic problem, which led to the software miscue, which led to the two crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, 346 people dying. The characteristic of the dive pattern of the plane is puzzling people, because usually a plane at 30,000 feet does not go down vertically unless there is a stabilizer breakdown or something akin to a suicide dive. So the investigation will be not only of interest to the Chinese aviation authorities, but it will be of great interest to the FAA and Boeing.
All right, thank you for that question. So it is not the MAX.
No, it's not the MAX.
Right. This next question comes to us from regular listener and frequent commenter, Don Harris. He says, you've had many guests that advocate for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. One problem with the amendment that you've not addressed is they say that money is not free speech. Purpose of this seems to be that the Citizens United ruling was based on the concept of money in the form of political contributions being free speech. By making political contributions no longer free speech, then Congress could pass legislation to limit big money contributions, as political contributions would no longer be a constitutional right. But that means that I also no longer have the right to make political contributions. The Ralph Nader that I know would not be advocating for taking away my constitutional right. Please explain this paradox.
Relax, Don. You still have a constitutional right to speak out independently against candidates or for candidates, or put an ad in a newspaper for and against, as long as you don't collaborate with the existing political campaign and candidacies that you are either supporting or otherwise opposing. What Citizens United did was it liberated the long-term federal statutory prohibition on corporations and unions making contributions to political campaigns, and lifted all ceilings on how much companies like Apple and Boeing and Pfizer can spend. So it doesn't restrict your constitutional right independently to make your views known on a political candidate and to pay for that, as long as you're not connecting your views with the candidacy. That's under a sublime regime called public financing of campaigns. So if there's ever full public financing of campaigns, that does not restrict your freedom of speech to independently make your views known and pay to disseminate those views.
All right, thank you for that question, Don. I want to thank our guests again, Professor Theodore Postol and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law is going virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history. And be sure to check out their latest program on how litigation on brain trauma is changing the future of football. All that and more at tortmuseum.org.
Ralph wants you to join the Congress Club. To get more information, go to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website, and in the top right margin, click on the button labeled Congress Club. We've also added a button right below that with specific instructions about what to include in your letters to Congress. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when our guest will be journalist Jessie Singer to discuss her new book, There Are No Accidents, The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price. And we'll be taping that episode live on Zoom, and you can join us this Wednesday, March 30th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Come watch us tape this episode. All you need is Zoom. Go to ralphnaderradiohour.com to sign up to be in our live Zoom audience. We look forward to meeting you. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, you can take, in effect, a 1-hour course in tort law, the law of wrongful injuries, designed to protect you and make you safer by just going to tortmuseum.org with the family and take a tour of this only tort museum in the world. All kinds of exhibits, tobacco, asbestos, GM Corvair, Ford Pinto, malpractice, all kinds of stories throughout history that will give you knowledge that will be personally important to you and your family.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, Ralph asked Professor Postol about where to find his work online, and David asks another question.
And is there a website that they can go to where they can read what you've written over the years?
I don't operate a website, but if you look at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you'll find some articles by me. And probably an article that was written in March of 2017 is a good article that will explain the overall situation with regard to both American nuclear forces and Russian problems with their early warning system. And I forget its title. March of 2017 is when it was published.
And also, you had an article in the Boston Globe in 2015, how a
yes,
nuclear
in 2015,
near miss,
right. And,
how a nuclear near miss in 1995 would be a disaster today. And you have an article in the New York Times, which is called "Are Trump and Putin Opening Pandora's Box?" Which is relevant.
This is about the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the dangers of accidents that could lead to rapid escalation there. Yes, that's true.
And that was sparked by Trump abrogating unilaterally the Intermediate Forces Treaty. And of course, there's a question of whether he had the authority to do that without the Senate, because the Senate ratified the treaty, and there are arguments by constitutional law specialists who say that it requires not just the president, but the Senate to abrogate a treaty.
Yeah, but let me also note that that article was sparked by the fact that I was in a Stanford seminar, and everybody there was talking about how the Russians were abrogating the INF treaty because of this issue of the cruise missile. I forget what it was, the KN-9 or something. And it was clear that we were also abrogating the INF treaty and had been doing so since about 2010 or 2011 with these units in Poland and Romania, these air defense units that were not simply air defense. They were capable of launching cruise missiles. And the Russians had been complaining about it for quite a while, for a decade at least at that point. And I just felt that somebody needed to write the truth about this, who knew what they were talking about, because I'm sitting in this Stanford center and all these self-righteous people are talking about the Russians without ever even understanding that the United States was a party to the problem. So we don't have a very well-informed establishment here, and that's a real problem too.
Are we still operating under mutual assured destruction? It seems to me that most Americans believe that it's mutual assured destruction, and that's why nobody's going to press the button. Have we pulled out of ABM treaties? Have we modified ABM treaties?
The way I would describe mutual assured destruction is that it's an existential condition, not so much a policy. So, for example, if you know that if I attack you, the result will be both of us dying, then you know that I will be deterred if I'm reasonable and logical from attacking you, if I'm not suicidal. And the same could be true of you. So that's an existential condition. We both restrain ourselves, even though we might hate each other or see each other as a terrible threat, from attacking the other because we know that both of us will die. So it's an existential condition. Now, when you build these missile defenses, you imply implicitly, you are suggesting that you think you can escape some aspect of this existential condition. It's not so much a change in policy as it is an indication that you don't necessarily fully accept that this existential condition cannot be dealt with. And that's one of the reasons why these missile defenses in the case of nuclear weaponry is a very dangerous thing to do, because it looks like you think you can escape the consequences, and this makes a potential adversary nervous, because I think it's very clear if we look very carefully, and I have done this, so I'm talking now from having studied this. If we look very carefully over the last few years about what Putin has done and what he has said about nuclear weapons, it is very clear that he is concerned that Western leadership might incorrectly believe that they can depend on missile defenses at some future time. He is very clear that he doesn't think they'll work. These missile defenses will work. But he's also been very clear that he is preparing for the possibility that if anyone tries to use them, he will assure them under any condition you can imagine that they will suffer the existential consequences of using nuclear weapons. It's very clear that he's afraid of what we think we understand, of what leaders think we understand. Now, I think it's extremely important that we understand that this man, Putin, is extremely intelligent and is a deep thinker about these strategic issues. He has made a terrible mistake. He is a terrible person. There's no question. The man has none of the moral constraints that an ethical person at any level would have. But it's a big mistake to assume that he's stupid. I think that's the problem here. People don't want to, you don't want to do that. And he's afraid of what the Americans might do. It's not a good situation.
And finally, we continue our conversation with constitutional scholar Bruce Fein about the Supreme Court hearing process.
My gosh, I think the worst of the worst was Lindsey Graham. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you pray? Does God hear you?
My favorite is, are babies racist?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I would say only the ones who were born with their little toothbrush mustache. But other than that, I think.
Oh, here's another one for your satire. How do you define a woman, Judge?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
How would you have answered that, Steve?
I go back to the Bee Gees and their song "More Than a Woman." More than a woman to me.
How many chromosomes do you want? Is it X and Y?
Yeah. No, I was telling Ralph earlier, Bruce, that I call these hearings tedious political theater company.
Yeah.
That's my theater company, the tedious political theater company.
Yeah, that's what it is.
You should do a satire like you did on, that other thing with the baseball. You should do a satire on this, Steve. There's some points of satire material that are unprecedented in the Judiciary Committee. Like this guy saying, how many homicides go without being detected? How many this? And and she should have said, well, do you mean street homicides or corporate homicides, Senator?
Yeah.
Well,
how about Sackler? How about the Sackler homicide, Senator?
Yeah, you would think that, if the Congress people don't want to ask the hard questions, then they could leave it to citizen testimony to ask those hard questions, and they could be buffered from that a bit. But I guess that's not even too close for that. So
even when you send them the questions, like we did on Roberts and Gorsuch, we actually send them the corporate questions to several senators that are predisposed. Never asked one. Not one.
Yeah. It's all about not giving any sort of fuel to the other side to argue against.
But of course, it's such cowardly because you can nail the Republicans' head to the wall on these things.
Yeah.
You see, like go to Cruz and say, you've been asking about street crime, Senator. You come from Texas. You understand how many reports there have been in the Wall Street Journal on corporate crime in Texas? Why don't you ask about that? That's why the citizens have to be allowed to testify, because they ask the unanswered major questions that are totally ignored, deliberately bipartisan ignored.
Yeah.
I mean, here they have all the time in the world, 30 minutes, and then they have their opening statements, the senators. They don't even mention corporations, like they don't exist.
Yeah.
I think that there's another element that complements what you're saying, Ralph, and that is because these people, they don't know half of what you know. They don't know they don't have the brain power to follow up and slam them to the ground, because their range of knowledge is limited to putting points on the political scorecard. So they don't know how to follow up. They don't see any of these questions in context, and they themselves can't see the gross hypocrisy. That's why you need experts there who know how to follow up and say, well, what about X, and point out the inconsistencies, the contradictions, what's being said, and embarrass them. But they don't have that knowledge. I mean, it used to be they permitted sometimes their aide or chief counsel to ask questions like they did in Watergate. That's out now.
You just prompted me to remember another thing that's no longer there. The senators, when they didn't get the right answer, they would say, I want you to send me a written response.
Yeah.
Elaborating this, because when the witness said, I don't know, or whatever, they don't even ask for written response. Bruce, did you hear in all you've watched this week, did you hear anybody say, see, even that's gone now.
Yeah.
We're heading toward, total dictatorship, elected dictators.
Yeah, it's kabuki theater.
I know I have a broken record. I still think there are a lot of things that got to be tried. We have to try to get these guys before they're co-opted in Congress. We have to have training institutes that give them the proper education and ethos before they get there. Because once they're there, they're co-opted by Pelosi and by McConnell and the money, and they don't know anything. They go up to the Kennedy School of Government and learn where the bathrooms are and stuff like that. But they don't understand the important things and what they can do.
That's right.
And
that's very important.
Yeah.
The level of ignorance, Steve, Hannah, Jimmy, David, the level of ignorance is beyond belief. For example, when presidents abrogate treaties, there isn't a single senator who said, you can't abrogate the ABM, George W. You can't abrogate the intermediate missile, Donald Trump. You can't abrogate treaties without the Senate going along, voting to abrogate. The Senate ratified the treaty after it was sent by the president, and only the Senate can clinch the abrogation of the treaty. They don't even know to ask the question. I mean, these are treaties that abrogate safeguards for the whole world against nuclear war. They don't even know to ask the question. When Bruce calls Congress an inkblot, I accuse him of understatement.
Yeah, even the language of the treaties themselves identify or use the term the United States can give notice. Well, my constitutional law, the president is not the United States of America. The government consists of the Congress as well. So even under the text of the treaty terms, as would be understood by the Senate that ratified it, the president is not the United States by himself.
These people couldn't pass a 10-question test on the Constitution.
No,
These
what I
senators
did, let me give you, I created a multiple choice test on the Constitution, gave it to Tim Wirth. Tim, I know Tim, and he attends some of these.
Senator,
former Senator Tim Wirth, Colorado, okay? He said, Bruce, this is way too hard. I said, way too hard? Are you kidding? It was things like we just talked about, the treaty, state secrets, declare war clause, oversight authority, inherent congressional power, delegation issues like this, things that would be staples, nothing all that unusual, even things like legislative veto and bill of attainder. Bruce, this is way too hard. And I said, this is aiming for civics grade 12.
The way to do it is get a town meeting, your senator, and just say you want to talk about Social Security. And after you talk about Social Security, you say, Senator, may we ask you some questions on the Constitution? We don't know that much about it, and you're an expert. And then throw the questions at them.
Yeah.
It'll be a total scandal. It'll be media in the whole state.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
And that's a wrap. Join us this coming Wednesday, March 30th, for our live Zoom event featuring author Jessie Singer about her book, There Are No Accidents. Go to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour to register to be in our audience. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way